also very interesting to underline that here NGOs are also invited to express their own opinion. Article 2 of the directive provides for early and effective public participation, and early means that public participation should be effective at an early point where all options are still open. It has no meaning if public is being invited when everything has already been decided upon. And of course, it has no point to invite the public to participate when the results of this consultation and participation are not being taken into consideration. So obviously this is also a legal imperative. So at an early stage we want the information, at an early stage we want the public consent to express their opinions, and it is important to state that the existence of an interest is sufficient to allow a citizen or a group to be considered as affected, to be included in the public concerned, terminus technicus, which, as I said before, makes the audience and the people to participate more and more wider public. So that was my comment. Let's hope with Professor Schofjell that actually there will not be a very big discrepancy between theory in books and in the practice. But of course this is still to be proved in every single occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, Professor Schofjell and Papadopoulou, for your really insightful comments. We do have some room for discussion now before we go on to your paper, which talks more specifically about Greece. So we have 10 minutes for discussion and questions. Yes, Professor Turnbull.
My name's Shan Turnbull from Australia, and I'd like to ask Professor Beatty, would she be willing to give meaning to the term sustainable development, a new meaning of sustainable prosperity, because you can have prosperity without economic growth, and it depends upon creating greater inequality, greater equality. So sustainable prosperity, I think, avoids the ambiguity of the conflict and resolves the conflict and gives you coherence to the term sustainable development, which suggests you must have economic growth, which is incompatible with sustaining life on the planet.
Thank you, Sean, for revisiting a discussion we've had a couple of times. I know there's a lot of criticism of the term sustainable development, and especially previously when it was even called sustainable growth. But it is a recognized concept that is used much in EU law, which is my area, so I prefer to use that concept and then rather define it and explain the way that I mean it, which is a balanced economic and social development within the planetary boundaries. And we can also refer to the Brundtland definition that Lina touched upon about satisfying the needs of the current generations while making it possible for future generations to meet their own needs. And I emphasize here needs, where several cars and penthouses and private planes don't fall within that context. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hello? Hello? Okay. Thank you to both for a very, very interesting talk on sustainability. I'd like to focus on the case study of Chalkidiki. What do we think went wrong there, or is going wrong there, and how does that link to the presentations or the lack of implementation of the law we already have, which appears to be, in theory, quite good in facilitating discussion? But if we take this to practice and we take it to a place that's very nearby us, what is the problem and how could that be mitigated in the future? Because obviously, I think what's important is that we discuss some issues that have to do with business in Greece, because one of the business Greece is yet in many areas a very nice place to visit is because we haven't had business growth. And if we do have business growth in Greece, which we obviously do, and we don't have it in a sustainable way, we might not have the image of Greece that we have today for that reason. So taking a case study which is very nearby, how can we link that to the presentations made?
Do you want to respond first, and then I can say something else?
Georgina, thanks for your question. I'm afraid that nothing from what I referred to happened in Chalkidiki. I mean, there was not awareness on the exact issues. I mean, there is a lot of information, but I'm not quite sure. I wouldn't bet that it is the right information, and I don't mean that somebody misleads, but I mean there was not from some formal or trustworthy lips, let me phrase it like that, what is really happening and what is really at stake there. There might be a lot or everything, or a little bit or nothing. I'm not quite sure. So I wouldn't say that we even had the first step like information, trustworthy information. Of course, we didn't have any participation except from the demonstrations. And of course, there we had some violence from the state. And we had demonstrations both in favor and against. So, I'm not against demonstrations in general, but I am not convinced that they might solve the problem. I mean, I would rather prefer a solution like in the books, like in paper, when you have trustworthy information from both sides and for significant time. And then, of course, have the public participation, but not in kind of demonstrations for and against, and with the police in between regulating. This is not a kind of public participation that would help, but rather through a constructed, maybe even through having a referendum in the area or in the wider area, in Chalkidiki, in Thessaloniki, maybe maybe the region, in the region. So you could have other ways of tackling with the issue. Instead, I think that all the sides, both in favor and against, are actually acting outside any reasonable way of solving disputes, let me say that.
If I might just briefly comment on that as well, I think it's so important that we don't see this as, okay, well, of course that directive isn't implemented properly, or the system doesn't work properly in Greece. What do you expect? Nothing works properly in Greece. We all know that Greece is the problem in Europe, right? No. Because if you look at Norway, which is a country where we think that laws are complied with, and we think that we have a high level of environmental protection, we have exactly the same kind of problems. We have the Norwegian government that has now just opened a new area for exploitation, oil and gas exploitation in the Barents Sea, a small part of the Arctic Sea. And it's, in my opinion, a very clear violation of the rules that you were talking about with impact assessment and information, and of our constitution, and indirectly also of international and EU constitutions, because exploiting this area for oil and gas is not at all coherent if we are aiming at keeping global warming within the 2 degrees that we have agreed on, and which is probably too high anyway. And I've gone through all those impact assessments that they are supposed to write, and it's totally incoherent. They've had experts that have identified the local environmental issues, and then they present, okay, these are the local environmental issues. What does that mean? Does that mean that we should consider not opening up this area? No, it means that we have to be careful when we do it. Okay, and what about climate? Yeah, climate is mentioned several times. Yeah, because climate makes this possible. Climate makes exploitation of the Arctic possible, and also climate has a negative impact on the local environment, but it's dealt with as if climate change was something that just came from the outside, and that there's no link between this and exploiting oil and gas. So when I see the way that this has been dealt with in Norway, then it becomes very clear that this is a deeply ingrained systemic problem. And we need, all of us, most of you are already, but all of us need to wake up and realize that the laws that are meant to protect the sustainability of this planet that we live on, both environmentally and socially, they are not being complied with. And when I mentioned penthouses and private planes, that was inspired by a film that I watched yesterday, a documentary kind of film about I think it was called The Inside Game or something like that, about the financial crisis. And it's just crazy. There are people who are only interested in short-term profit and making as many millions as they can in the short run, who are doing anything that they can to game the system. And those are the kind of problems that we are dealing with. And there are lobbyists that are preventing the proper implementation of laws. So we as scholars have a great responsibility here to take our societal responsibility seriously and point out where the problems are, which law is not being complied with, which directive is not being implemented, which policy or business decisions are totally illegal. That's what we need to do.
My name is Tine Klamboy. I'm a professor of corporate law at Nijrode Business University. And I also had a question about the Hadekdiki. It's a gold mine, as I understand. The question is, did they do environmental impact assessment in advance? And were all the communities around this area involved in this environmental impact assessment, like the directive and the Aarhus Convention are requiring? So that's my question. And then I also had a comment in line with Professor Beate Scheffel's comment. There are 3 interesting cases in Australia on environmental impact assessments on plants. So before they got the license for the coal power plant, there were environmental impact assessments, and then there was administrative litigation about the question whether or not the environmental impact assessment should take into account the effects on climate change, and especially the 2 degrees. So I can share some information about those case studies. So my point that I want to make is that administrative law can really help us bring environmental sustainability further. So it's very important to, so I was very happy with your presentation on the administrative side of the business process. But the question is about the Hadekdiki mine, how that went in practice, because I think it's a very interesting case study.
Yes, I see this gentleman in the front wanted to ask a question, and we really are running short of time, so maybe after this question you can respond and we'll move on.
Thank you. I'm your host here today. I'm Vice President of the Thessaloniki Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and I'd like to make some comment on the dilemma between sustainable and development. Of course it is a dilemma. It is part of a greater dilemma, I think, because the question of sustainability, when it is clear, it can have a very right answer. But where it is unclear, where it is between something that can happen and something that will not happen, then it very easily can be translated into a conflict of interests. And then we try to give the public the right to decide about possible conflicts of interest. That is indeed very difficult. It is something that puts the body of decision making under considerable stress. You have an information from this side, you have the information from the other side. Sometimes you are not the specialist, you have to decide. In general, the public is not the specialist who has to decide if this study is correct or the other study is not. And that is something that requires a lot of effort. Okay, effort is something that has to be made in order to have some rational and sustained decision. But it is also something that weighs up experiences from the past with some theoretical approaches from the future. And that makes this dilemmatic situation more complex than envisaged in this formula, sustainable or not, development or not. And that is one of the basic questions for the future, I think.
Good morning. I would like to ask you one short question, but I think it's a very critical one. Sometimes we see that public is very suspicious on every business project and every business plan, even if the business plan complies very well to the European environmental law. Do you think that, do you believe that complying with the European environmental law is a strong enough argument for the business to go on?
Okay, maybe if we can have two reasonably brief answers, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity over coffee break later.
Well, I see Mr. Vlachogiannis' comment as a reply to your question, as a matter of fact. Yes, there was an environmental impact assessment, and also we had the last phase of what is provided, the judicial decision adjudication. So we did have, let's say, the technocratic and the judicial part. What I said we missed was actually the public participation and information and consultation part. So I'm not saying that everything was illegal or something. I'm not saying that, not at all. It was legal, but I missed from my side the public participation exactly because there is a lot at stake there for the people, especially for those living in the area, because they get their money, they earn their lives from both the gold mine and tourism. And of course, tourism might be undermined through this gold mine thing. So there are also economic interests at stake, and not only, let's say, ideological, whatever, you know, like believing in the one or the other, but there are also economic interests at stake. People who work there and get their job from the gold mine, and people who work at tourism, they're afraid we're going to lose our income for the next 100 years if something goes wrong. So what I missed is not the technocratic and the judicial part, is the public participation part.
Well, thank you. There were very many good questions, and I'll try to be brief, as Charlotte asked, because I can see we're also behind time. Very, very good points that you made, sir. And first of all, in the long term, we have to find out either how to decouple environmental, economic growth totally from environmental impacts, totally, not 99%, but totally, or change our economic system. And I think it's the latter we have to do. And I agree that there are quite a few hard cases where it's difficult to decide exactly what is the most sustainable choice, but there are also a lot of easy cases where the wrong decisions are being made, and where policymakers are allowing themselves to be confused by business lobbyists, where 97% of the scientists, natural scientists, may, for example, agree and have substantiated this very well, and then they draw out of the hat one paper that suggests something else. It might be written by somebody who's not even working in that field and who's been paid to write it, and then, okay, maybe this, maybe that, we don't know. So there are a lot of easy cases, and we also have to remember that there's a legal framework within which policy and political discussions are meant to be made. So we have to stay within that framework. These are very short answers to your very good question. And to your good question, I'm going to be even shorter and say that there are a lot of issues that make it very difficult for businesses to be sustainable and for investors and consumers and procurers to know which ones are sustainable. We're doing research in that in an international project, and I'll speak more about that at the book launch at the drinks reception today. So I hope you'll be there and we can discuss that further then. Thank you.
Thank you, professors, for two very stimulating, provocative presentations, and I think they've set the tone very nicely for the day. And that allows us now to move on to Professor Panagiatos Liarogovas from the Peloponnese University Department of Economics, and you'll be talking about the Economic Adjustment Programme of Greece. Thank you.
Okay, let me first thank the organizers, especially Elena Papadopoulou, my colleague, and also the other colleagues from University of Oslo, Bristol, the Chamber of Commerce here that is hosting us, and congratulate you for this stimulating conference. It's about stimulating business, but I think it's stimulating ideas. Okay, now my presentation is going to be focused on Greece, and actually is a presentation by an economist, but it's going to be easy it is based on actually it's on a review paper, and it touches upon various issues in the literature and taking some lessons. And actually, the main question is what went wrong in Greece? Because, as you know, 5 years ago, it was actually on May 2nd, 2010, Greece found itself in a very difficult position, deprived from capital markets. And at that time, the Eurogroup and the IMF agreed on a loan to Greece, 110 billion euros. And the expectation was that after 3 years of an economic fiscal adjustment program, Greece would go out to the markets again, to the private markets. But this didn't happen. Of course, we are still 5 years after 2010, and Greece still is not out to the markets, to the capital markets. Actually, on October 2011, there was a second loan and a second package adjustment program, and based on specific measures and structural reforms, as well as combined with the restructuring of the private sector, of the debt held by private sector. So Greece is still deprived from the private markets, from the private capital markets. And at the same time, other countries like Portugal, Spain, Ireland, and Cyprus, which is on the way, Portugal and Ireland are already out to the private capital markets, and they went in the, I mean, in the economic, in any similar economic adjustment program after Greece. So what has gone wrong? There should be an explanation why Greece is still out, is still under an economic adjustment program, and we still see the problems of dealing with all these issues related to the economic adjustment program, and still the expectations for an immediate exit to the capital, to the private capital markets is still far away. So the question then is very, very crucial, and it has to, in this paper I try to give answers to this crucial question based on previous literature and empirical research. But let me first, okay, the structure of the paper is first we will discuss some methodological issues, because it's not that easy to answer this question. Then we will focus on a comparative picture of Greece 2008 and Greece 2013. I've chosen these two different pictures of Greece because 2008 was a year that Greece had the highest GDP per capita ever, and 2013 was a year that Greece had the worst social problems ever. So we have two extreme cases in 2008 and 2013. Okay, first, some methodological issues. It is difficult to make an assessment of a program, of an economic adjustment program, like the one that we have, because programs are always based on forecasts. And forecasts, as you know, are forecasts. You cannot be 100% sure that things will be fulfilled based and will go exactly as the forecasts predict. The program parameters are often subject to renegotiation. We've seen this many times. There have been renegotiations. You first have a program, an initial program, but then the government that implements the program and the creditors discuss and sometimes change things. So the initial program might not be the same as firstly was structured, but it might end up in various issues very different from the beginning. Third, not all policy decisions taken by country result from the assistance program. There are many areas where the program does not intervene. So, because in economic policy you have various policy issues, it doesn't mean that all these policy issues are tackled by the program. So there is a discretion also by the government, by the executive, to do some policy choices. But you always have the whole picture, so it's difficult to see the different parts of the program and the government. And fourth, programs. The success of a program is contingent on the implementation. Okay, you have a program, you have initially a program, but it doesn't mean that the government implements the program as it is, as it stands. And in Greece, actually, we've seen this many times. Implementation is not always so successful. and many policy choices have been altered because of various problems. And finally, all program outcomes are affected by spillovers from other countries. Almost all countries, especially in Europe, are small open economies, and of course there are spillovers. What happens in one part of the world might affect also the economy of the home country. So, but this doesn't mean that the program, the outcome might be due to this spillover effect and not to the program itself. So there are many issues that one has to take into consideration before evaluating a program, because otherwise the conclusion might not be robust. What I do here, okay, because I have a question mark, what went wrong, and this question mark goes to the fact that Greece is still deprived from the private capital market. So the initial expectation was that initially by the end of 2013, then by the end of 2014, Greece would be out to the capital markets, but it's not. So this is a question then. In this paper, I focus on specific topics of European relevance, starting with a picture of Greece before and after the crisis. So 2008 was before the crisis, and you can see some data here as regards GDP per capita, which was very high. The red, I've in purpose put on red the bad indicators, let's say, and the green is for indicators that were in a better shape. For example, in 2008 we had, that was the picture, we had a high GDP per capita, and at the same time, the social, let's say, the social sector was not in that, did not have many imbalances. We did not have unemployment. Unemployment was just 7.7%. But in 5 years later, unemployment was 27.3%. So we had a steep increase within a short period of time. Also, poverty increased, social exclusion increased, inequality increased all these years. So the social situation was very worsening during these 5 years. But what was in a better shape in 2013 has to do with fiscal indicators, let's say, and also the growth. In 2013, we have a positive sign in terms of primary surplus, in deficits. We've turned all the deficits into surpluses. In 2008, we had deficits in the macroeconomy. We had fiscal deficit, we had a current account deficit, huge current account deficit, about 15% of GDP. But in 2013, we do not have deficits anymore, or very small deficits as regards fiscal, for example, deficit. We turn most of these signs into positive, but we had very negative picture in the social situation. So, and then one wonders, okay, was the first picture sustainable? Okay, the answer is no, because we ended up with these problems. Is the second picture sustainable? The answer is still no, because of these imbalances in the social sector. Okay, I could show you the great drop in GDP also, about 25% all these years, 25 percentage points drop of GDP, the increase in debt. Okay, what went wrong? I will focus in the rest of the time in six causes, six factors. One is austerity, and actually it's the other one is the policy mix itself. The third factor is related to expectations, and then to institutions, to fairness and exports. And this differentiates Greece from other European countries, Eurozone countries. Austerity. There's a lot of critique on austerity, or actually on front-loaded austerity that was implemented, on horizontal, on extreme austerity that was implemented in Greece. There are many researchers that have stressed this, that austerity is related to the snowball effect, because the more austerity you implement, the greater the drop of GDP, and then the less revenue you have, and then the more deficits you create. So you, again, there's a vicious cycle, and as long as you try to reach the target, you miss the target, because there's always a moving target. This is called snowball effect. There's an empirical study by Paul de Gros that shows the relationship, the positive relationship between austerity and debts. Countries that had implemented more extreme austerity ended up with higher debts. Also, countries that implemented more extreme austerity ended up with higher GDP drop. You see the various countries here. Greece is always, here is at the bottom. The extent of austerity was greater, and the GDP growth was the less. Actually, it was negative in this case. The same holds for debts. Okay. A second, so one, of course, you can find a lot of literature, papers on austerity. Another factor is the policy mix itself. The Greek adjustment program was not sufficiently based on permanent cuts on primary expense. There is in the literature, in the academic literature, and the empirical literature as well, there is a huge discussion about what is more efficient. Is it better to have cuts in expenses or increases in tax revenues? The answer is based on empirical research, is the mix is better to be around 70% on the expenditure side, and around, because there are many variations, but 70-30 is the optimum policy mix, as we say. But in Greece, only in 2010 and 2013, this fact was hardly implemented. In the recessionary years, which was 2011, 2012, where we have a cumulative loss of GDP about 15%, 15.5%, only 5% and 49% respectively were on the expenditure side. So in the years that we had such big drop of GDP, it was mainly the tax side, the tax revenue. Actually, the tax increases, not tax revenue. The tax increase that the economic adjustment program was based upon. Expectations. Expectations is another factor, because if you have negative expectations at the same time when implementing a program, these expectations work as a self-fulfilling prophecy. people, if people expect that nothing will happen, or that things will get worse, then this affects their behavior, and then the behavior is like a policy tool, and it affects the final outcome. I don't have much time to explain this, but I will refer to two examples, rather to one example. We had, this is not the first time that we have, countries have economic adjustment programs. In the past, we used to call them stabilization programs. In the more recent past, we had a convergence program before entering the euro. In that convergence program in Greece, which was also based on some kind of austerity is always there, but in this program it was extreme austerity. At that program, the convergence program that we in the late 90s we experienced, expectations in Greece were very positive. They were very positive because the public believed that, okay, Greece will enter the euro, we will enter a new area where euro will stimulate businesses. Didn't happen anyway, but the expectations were very positive at that time. Nowadays, that we have these economic adjustment programs, expectations are very negative, and this affects finally the final outcome. Inappropriate statements about Brexit, not only from European officials, also do a lot of damage to and create this negative effect. Domestic institutions matter. This is what many authors, many researchers continually stress. Also, institutions matter. Let me give you an example. In Greece, we try to, also the timing of when you do something, plays a role. One example is this internal devaluation that we try to implement, internal devaluation. We try to, one of the first measures of the economic adjustment program was to reduce wages in the private sector so as to make the economy more competitive. Okay, this sounds as far as competitiveness is concerned, it sounds good. Not good for the lowering for the workers, but it sounds good for the final end of reaching competitiveness, increasing competitiveness. But if at the same time you do not implement changes and you do not restructure the goods sector, then reducing wages will not result in the expected outcome, because it is only a part of the competitiveness of the whole of the pricing of the product. The pricing of the product consists of wage cost. It consists of inputs, materials that you use. It consists of taxes, taxes that might increase. If at the same time you increase taxes, you have higher energy prices. You have goods that are because of oligopolies, because markets are based on oligopolies, are expensive. So the final outcome, okay, it will not be that great, because the wage part is only a small part of the pricing of the product. So that, and this has to do with institutions, because the way goods market work is an institutional issue. You have to create a more competitive economy, not an economy based on oligopolies. and increasing. The same holds for tax administration. If you try to increase taxes, and then at the same time you restructure the whole system of tax administration, then you might fail, because you have one institutional change and you expect to have revenues. In the middle of this change, you first have to implement the tax restructuring, administration restructuring, and then increase the taxes in order to be more effective. Otherwise, you will not have the outcome that you expect. So, and many authors say that support that that Greece, as compared to other countries, for example, Cyprus has a better institutional base compared to Greece. It had a better institutional base even before the crisis, not during the crisis. So, if you need to have an institutional base as more efficient as you can, and then implement a program. Otherwise, you might end up with a failure. The same is for European institutions. We've seen European institutions to be lagging behind, always. Always the decisions were too late, too little, too late. The European architecture, the Eurozone architecture, was not sufficient to face the crisis. There was no protection mechanism at the beginning, but they started discussing all these protection mechanisms and actually completed this discussion after 2012, but it was too late at that time. Okay, fairness. There was only a couple of weeks actually after May 2000. In May 2010, there was a paper written by Blanchard and Contarelli, both work in the IMF, and they had 10 commandments. The sixth one was about fairness. Programs should be fair. Because if they are not fair, then combined with negative expectations, they create social tensions. And these social tensions then are one factor that might affect the outcome, the effectiveness of the program itself. So fairness, government should tend to forget the fairness issue. In the Greek case, the belief is that the program itself was unequally, the burdens were unequally distributed. And the main burden fell on the middle and the lower class. And this creates another obstacle for the success of the program. And finally, and I'll be here for questions, exports. Another issue is export performance, actually. In Greece, before the program, the export base was very low. So we could not take advantage first of all, we could not take advantage of the big export base. If internal devaluation was successful, then we would be able, but internal devaluation finally was not successful. But one of the reasons was also that we had a very small export base to take advantage. But at the same time, the performance was very small. We did not manage to increase export during exports during that economic adjustment program. In Ireland, exports increased to over 100% of GDP. In Greece, the increase in exports was very small, less than 10% at the beginning. Why? Because the export base was very small, and second, because the internal devaluation was not successful because of various other costs that also contribute to the final price of the products. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Liagovas. That was a very, I felt, quite a depressing paper actually, but it explained a lot to me, because coming from the UK, the way things were presented about Greece, it was very simplified. You know, the impression that one was given from our media was, oh, well, the Greeks, they retire early and they don't pay their taxes, so hard luck. But what you've presented is a much more complex picture, and that you've highlighted to me the importance of the surrounding context. But I'll leave it open to the floor to ask questions. Maybe if we have 5 minutes for questions and move on, so that we can keep within the programme of the day. Thank you. Tineke?
Very interesting presentation, thank you. I was wondering, why do you consider export so important? I mean, Greece is a country that has so much tourism, so the people come to Greece to spend their money and to bring their money for hotels and to holiday destinations. So nobody goes to Ireland for sitting on the beach there and going to islands. And so why do you make this comparison? I didn't understand it really. Nonetheless, the very good olive oil that you export. But may I?
I thought that was a fascinating presentation. I thought it was somebody stating the obvious, yet it hasn't been implemented or considered. So I'm very grateful that we had this presentation by you today. What I think is important to focus on is also the why. So, of course, this is an economic analysis, I suppose, but also why, since things are quite clear as to, from the empirical evidence as to what works, especially with taxes and how institutions implement, there's also a question of why these aren't being considered not only by policy, but not being considered also by media. So, coming back to Charlotte's point, why is there this masking of the reality that's going on? And I think it is a very depressing paper on the one hand, but then a very optimistic paper on the other, because you actually do indicate that with specific changes, or if specific things take their course, things can actually change. And focusing on what you said on the self-fulfilling prophecy, I do think all this negative media actually does build the impression that nothing can change. But actually, if we look at your presentation, I think it might be a bit bold to say, without affording disrespect to the new Minister of Finance, it would be lovely if you could implement everything that you outline in your paper. Since there is evidence as to what can be done, it's actually a quite optimistic paper in the sense that things can change. It's just, it might be the political will, which is completely absent. And the fact that maybe the public doesn't engage in asking these questions or trying to become more aware of what needs to be changed.
Professor Turnbull, and then maybe you can respond.
May I ask another why question, is why do you want to rely on external capital markets to get expensive euros when you can issue your own negative cost euros internally like they do in Germany in the Chiemgau region? In Germany there's negative interest rate money circulating, and this is a way to avoid the toxic euros and get your low cost national sovereignty back.
Would you like to respond?
Okay. Yes. First of all, let me start with the why, because this is the the more it's not it's the more complicated issue. Why? Because we followed in Greece and we followed a model, let's say a developmental model that was based on issues that deprived us from, let's say, Europeanize our country. For example, a model based on populism, a model based on corruption, a model based on delays of reforming our societies, because our political system, let's say, was not that so strong. They did not have this strong will to go against specific organized interests in the economy that were resisting to any change. And I was optimistic back in back in the 80s. I was optimistic that Greece, being a member of the European Economic Community at that time, will be a factor, a pressure to make institutions to become to build strong institutions, actually. Then I was optimistic that with the euro, becoming a member of the Eurozone, we would be able to take advantage of the strong currency and the low interest rates. But it never happened. We became member of the European Economic Community, and we only we changed our economy from a productive model from a productive model to a consumption model. Because we found this all these amounts, the structural from the regional policy of the European Union, and it was an easy money. If we add all these amounts that we absorbed, it is more than 100 billion euros, and this is not a loan. It's money given to us, but this money, maybe it was a cursed money. It was money that did a lot of damage to our behavior, because private sector got used to easy absorption of money from the European Union. Even the public sector also used to absorb this money to do programs because of absorption, and not because of creating strong institutions. So that was initial. Then the euro, instead of being a means to increase investment because of the so low interest rates, it was a means of increasing consumption. And so everybody was consuming. We